The Civil War of the United States was without a doubt the most polarizing and devastating thing to happen on U.S. soil since the founding of this country. When Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 presidential election, 7 southern states seceded from the Union, thereby forming their own government. Abraham Lincoln was ready to take these Southerners to task, but they were beginning to claim federal land and fire on federal forts, thus beginning the Civil War that lasted from 1861 to 1865 to determine if slavery would be legal in the United States and who would run the formal government of these lands. Brother against brother, Confederate against Union soldier, it began. The Commonwealth of Kentucky was nearly torn apart by the Civil War. In reality, Kentucky wanted nothing to do with the Civil War. Beriah McGoffin and the legislature in 1860 declared that Kentucky would be neutral. However, on a practical level, that was impossible. You were either in the Union or you were in the Confederacy. The Confederates wanted Kentucky because of its natural resources, its supplies, horses, mules, pigs, and food. Kentucky was a leader in the nation in manufacturing in the early 1860s. And so you can see why the Confederates would want to claim the land. They as well would have a natural border with the Ohio River, and from there they could launch military forays into Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois. The Union entered Kentucky in 1861 under the command of General Bull Nelson, a soldier who will feature heavily in the Battle of Richmond. The Union soldiers established a camp called Camp Dick Robinson in Garrett County, and it was a Union training camp for loyal Kentuckians and East Tennesseans. East Tennessee was very pro-Union because they didn't have a slave base, and similarly, only 23% of Kentuckians owned slaves. And as has been said many times, this was a war of brothers against brothers. Quite literally, Kentucky had sent 40,000 troops to the south and 100,000 troops to the north. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1861, it does not have blanket coverage for all slaves. There are 4 areas that the slaves were not freed: Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky, because Kentucky was being viewed at the time as not an insurrection like Tennessee and Alabama. Therefore, the slaves in Kentucky were not freed until 1865. And because of the scale and the disastrous effects of the Civil War, so many aspects of the war to end slavery in the United States are overlooked. On the exact same days as the Battle of Richmond, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jeb Stuart are throttling a Union army at the Battle of Second Manassas or Second Bull Run, approximately 30 miles from Washington, D.C. Yet, our story is a little further to the west and a little closer to home, but nonetheless, so important.
The Battle of Richmond, Kentucky is fought on August 29th and 30th, 1862. It is a pivotal part of the 1862 Confederate advance into the Bluegrass state. But there's planning that goes along before this battle. In July of 1862, John Hunt Morgan has a raid up into central Kentucky, and he finds that the Kentuckians are kind of ripe for the pickings for the Confederacy. And he goes back and tells Major General Edmund Kirby Smith and Braxton Bragg that 20,000 Kentuckians will flock to the Confederate cause and go up in there. So Braxton Bragg and Edmund Kirby Smith meet in Chattanooga, Tennessee on July the 31st, 1862, to devise a plan to rid Kentucky of the federal occupiers, and in that process rid a lot of Tennessee, northern Mississippi, northern Alabama. Get those federal troops out of there.
The Confederacy was in need of more men, more land, and materials such as saltpeter and food and fresh water. As well, the Confederacy was ready to force the Union to retreat out of Middle Tennessee and other key Confederate states. The Confederacy strategy called for Major General Edmund Kirby Smith to move his force of approximately 19,000 men into Kentucky using what is now the Interstate 75 corridor. Meanwhile, Confederate General Braxton Bragg would move his approximate 35,000 man army around Nashville and into the Commonwealth of Kentucky using the Interstate 65 corridor. Kirby Smith and Bragg operated independently of each other.
There are not a whole lot of federal troops in Kentucky at the time, and the ones that are very new recruits, very poorly trained, if any at all. So Kentucky is kind of ripe for this. So Edmund Kirby Smith takes off from Knoxville with 4 divisions. He is concerned about the Union garrison at Cumberland Gap. So he dispatches one of his divisions to go northeast to hold those Union soldiers in check. One thing Kirby Smith doesn't know is those Union troops are starving, and they really don't pose too much of a threat, but he doesn't know that. The other 3 divisions start coming up to Kentucky through the gaps in the mountains and along a road that's known as the Old State Road, which is now mostly US 421, US 25. He gets up into the state and comes across Big Hill, and on the afternoon of August the 29th, his cavalry commander, Colonel John Scott, is ahead of Kirby Smith's army, and he runs into lead units of a federal army under the direct command of Brigadier General Mahlon Manson.
Confederate cavalry defeated Union troops at the Battle of Big Hill, about 10 miles south of Richmond City proper. However, they were forced to retire due to the arrival of Union reinforcements. Early in the morning on August 30th, 1862, Edmund Kirby Smith instructs Patrick Claiborne and Thomas Churchill, 2 of his brigadier division officers, to start moving forward up the Old State Road, expecting to run into Union infantry under General Manson. There is another Union division in Richmond under Charles Cruft. Patrick Claiborne, though, is in the lead and places his Texas artillery on a ridge north of the village of Kingston. By the time that Union General Mahlon Manson has moved in close to where the Mount Zion Church is today, a church that is standing where the battlefield happened, he sets up 8 to 9 cannons on both sides of the road, and at about 7 a.m. on the 30th, the artillery barrage starts.
So the Union troops did a pretty good job of holding them off. They held them off for 3 times before the Texas Brigade flanked them, and they broke and they started moving north. This is what you call a running battlefield. It's 13 miles long. Because they tried to stop them at Duncannon Lane, Creek Bed, which is now a railroad track, and that didn't work. They tried stopping them in the cemetery in town. Some of the stones in that town, in the cemetery, might have bullet bruises. They tried, and then they just kept heading north. They finally surrendered somewhere around exit 90.
So after the 2-hour artillery duel, it's the infantry's turn. And Patrick Claiborne orders some of his men to start moving up what would be General Manson's left flank, which is now currently on the Bluegrass Army Depot property. And they're feeling out what Manson's got up here. They're trying to get on his flank. And while all this is going on, the other division, Confederate division commander, Thomas Churchill, is going to take his men, cut down a little road known as Crooksville-Lancaster Pike, and then cut up a ravine known today as Churchill's Draw. How he knew about this, we don't know. We believe that they had to have had good on-the-ground intelligence or a local guide, because the maps were not that great at the time. But by using this creek bed, this draw, this ravine, Churchill is going to be able to put his men on Manson's right flank, and Manson doesn't even know he's there. Now, while Claiborne his men are jockeying around on the Union left, one of Claiborne's regimental commanders, by the name of Lucius Polk, who is also a friend of Patrick Claiborne in Arkansas, gets wounded. He gets hit in the head, wounded and all that bad, but they think it's much worse, so they're bringing him off the field. Patrick Claiborne rides up, and while they're talking, a Yankee round comes, hits Patrick Claiborne in the mouth, takes out 2 to 5 teeth, depending on the account, and thus Patrick Claiborne is taken out of the fight. And his senior regimental commander, Colonel Preston Smith of the 154th Senior Tennessee Infantry, takes over command of Claiborne's division. Now, granted, Kirby Smith is also on the field, and he's directing all these pieces also.
So now that the sprawling battlefield had been set and the players put into their place, the battle was underway, and the Union believed that they had a slight upper hand. However, they did not realize they were about to be outflanked by Texans and Arkansans coming out of that secret ravine known as Churchill's Draw. Brigadier General Mahlon Manson had sent a courier to ask for help from Charles Cruft, but by the time the message got there and Cruft had reached the Battle of Richmond, they had been outflanked and it was too late.
When Cruft gets out here, he and Manson start putting Cruft's men, his regiments, into the battle piecemeal. The 95th Ohio go in on the Union right, just south of Mount Zion Church, and at the same time, those Texans and Arkansans are coming out of Churchill's Draw. While this is going on, the 18th Kentucky Infantry, which is the most experienced of the Union regiments, they go in on Manson's left on the current Army Depot property. While Manson's line is collapsing, they're trying to stabilize things, and things don't work out. Both flanks of Manson's line, even with Cruft's reinforcements, collapse. The Confederates also come up the old state road, but when they get up to the Union line is no longer there. It's already all fallen apart. When the Union forces came out, they did commandeer the Mount Zion Christian Church, the same church that's there today, as a hospital. It was hit at least once by Confederate artillery fire, and the scars are still there. The church is still active, and they're a great partner with us. And the pews in the church are the same pews that they used in 1862.
I don't think anybody actually aimed at the building because there was a yellow flag out front, and the yellow flag meant we have wounded men here. Don't fire on this building. It's the same as a Red Cross today. So I don't think anybody fired on it. I think it ricocheted off the big trees and hit the wall. But of course, the wall is so thick that it didn't come through. That morning was very hot. And the people woke up. It was going to be about 100 degrees that day. And they started hearing rumbling in the ground. They knew a war was going on, and they figured out what was happening, even though they didn't really know that the Confederate Army had moved up through the Cumberland Gap and was here. But they guessed right away what was going on. So the women started making soup and gathering up their quilts and bandages and whatever else they could think of, and the men headed over here to see what was going on. The Union surgeon came down and found this building, and he said, that'll make a good hospital. So he came in and set it up as a hospital. Unfortunately, he didn't have anything to work with. He had only been the surgeon for about 2 weeks, and he had ordered medicines and bandages and things that he might need from Cincinnati, but the wagon hadn't caught up with him yet, so he had nothing to work with. But that was okay, because within a little while, the Confederate surgeon came in and he said, we are taking over this building because we're winning this battle. And the Union man said, am I a prisoner? He said, no. We're going to need everybody we can get.
19 men died in the Mount Zion Church on the first day of the Battle of Richmond. There are no records of how many wounded were treated in the building. It could have been well into the hundreds. They were treated by Union and Confederate surgeons alike.
They started bringing in the wounded into the building. Every pew was full. And they weren't just Union and they weren't just Confederate. They were alternating and side by side, and nobody made any difference in which one they were. Of course, the yard was also full. They set up a operating table over here in this corner. That wall wasn't there. That was the closest to the water. There was also a spring a little further on down so they could get fresh water when they needed it. Germs hadn't been discovered. They weren't aware that they had to be cleaned. That wasn't part of the question. So they operated right over here. They threw the arms and legs out the window. And the story is that the arms and legs came up to the windowsill.
During the Civil War, an estimated 476,000 soldiers were wounded by sabers and bayonets, bullets, and artillery shrapnel. The most common wounds suffered by Civil War soldiers were from musket balls, or more commonly known as Minié balls. Over the course of the Civil War, there was great need for surgeries. 3 out of 4 surgeries, or around 60,000 operations, were amputations. This earned surgeons throughout the armies a reputation of being butchers, when in fact amputations were one of the quickest, most effective ways for surgeons to treat as many patients as possible in a short amount of time with limited resources. However, the situation could have been much more dire if it was not for the work of women like Florence Nightingale and all of the nurses that were inspired by her. During her work in the Crimean War, Florence Nightingale was able to help sharply reduce the death rate of soldiers in field hospitals. She was able to do this by imploring the British government to send sanitary commissions to fix the shoddy conditions in these field hospitals, because 10 times more soldiers were dying from illness rather than solely from wounds illnesses such as typhoid, dysentery, cholera, tuberculosis, and simple infections. And as for our survivors and amputees over here in the Civil War, they would not have made it if it were not for the hygienic and medical practices that were instilled into institutions by Florence Nightingale. In fact, the Union government asked her advice on how to organize field medicine for their troops, and the United States also created a U.S. Sanitary Commission inspired by her work, showing the impact of sanitation and hygiene on health. And not only that, Nightingale mentored America's first trained nurse, Linda Richards, who came back to the United States with the knowledge and skills to set up high-quality nursing schools in America, just as Florence Nightingale had set up a nursing school in the United Kingdom. Florence Nightingale also was influential to nuns and other orders of religious medical practitioners. For example, the Sisters of Charity were widespread throughout Kentucky and other states during the Civil War. Over 2 million men fought in the American Civil War, and around 620,000 people died in the Civil War, representing roughly 2% of the population at the time. The amount of men who died would have been higher than it even was without the work of the Sisters of Charity and other nuns and nurses just like them. The Sisters of Charity were started by Elizabeth Seton in Maryland, but it was the Cincinnati chapter, headed up by Sister Mary O'Connell, that sent its nuns and nurses to the battlefields of Kentucky, and in particular the Battle of Richmond, to help out in the Mount Zion Church and inside of a home that today is called Mount Pleasant.
Many people were taken up in this room. If you could get upstairs on your own, you could come up here and be nursed by whoever came to help. And the Sisters from Charity of Cincinnati came down, and they settled in Richmond at Mount Pleasant. This is called Pleasant View. And they were there for 3 months taking care of the seriously wounded. They were trained nurses. The Sisters of Charity and several other religious organizations had trained nurses that could do surgeries and assist doctors. So they were called up to all the battlefields, starting with Bull Run. But these are the ones that came to this battlefield. And they stayed and they took care of the most seriously injured. And there's a place in the cemetery where there is a Confederate burial, mass burial, and a Union burial. So this whole town takes all this information in.
Now there's one major player that has not shown up yet. That's Union Major General Bull Nelson. On the night of the 29th, after the fighting and things, Manson sends Bull Nelson a message to Lexington. You have to remember, Richmond does not have any telegraph at the time. This has to be done by horseback. But Manson's not exactly sure where Nelson is. So he sends a message to Lexington. He also sends a message to Lancaster. When Bull Nelson gets the message about 2 a.m. on August 30th, he responds rather quickly and tells Manson, don't bring on an engagement unless you know you can win. Come and meet me in Lancaster. But the problem with that is the message arrives too late. By the time Manson gets the message, he's already had one fight and he's in the midst of another one. So when Bull Nelson gets the message in the middle of the night, he takes off and goes to Lancaster. And he and an aide, when he gets to Lancaster, the story is that he heard the artillery fire from the Battle of Richmond 25 miles away. And he takes off coming toward Richmond. When he gets to Richmond, he is met with the remnants of his supposed army. and he attempts to form a third line basically in the Richmond cemetery. Most of it is in the cemetery property. The cemetery wasn't near as big then, with a little bit on the north side of that turnpike. It's about 4:30 in the afternoon. There's been some conjecture exactly whether he was trying to wait until darkness to get his men away. That's kind of not a Bull Nelson's personality, but it's possible. So he lines his men up, meaning Nelson, and at the same time, Kirby Smith is moving his men forward on up into the Richmond area. And about 4:30 or so, Kirby Smith attacks the Union line that's in the Richmond Cemetery. I personally think they attack piecemeal, meaning that they hit the Union right flank first, and as that gets engaged, then another bunch of Confederates hit the Union center. It's a timing. And as all this is going on, the units start falling down like dominoes. And the entire Union Army goes back through Richmond, up the main street, trying to get back to Lexington via the Lexington Road. Now, while all this is going on, sometime that morning, Kirby Smith dispatches his cavalry commander, Colonel John Scott, with a bunch of his Louisiana troopers, the 1st Louisiana, and they make a wide looping movement around Richmond in order to cut the Union Army off. And so late in the day, probably 6, 7 o'clock in the evening, while the Union Army completely disorganized, there is no chain of command, there's nothing, there's just a mob going out this road. There's John Scott, and he cuts the Union Army off trying to get to Lexington. There are some Union troops that do get out another way. Bull Nelson is able to sidestep that trap and get north. General Cruft gets north. Maitland Manson, out in the area where Jack's Creek Pike comes out on US 25, is accosted by a Louisiana trooper. Manson's horse rears and he falls off of it and he's injured and thusly is captured. John Scott, when he sends a report to Kirby Smith, he said he bagged a whole lot of them. He has a 10-acre lot full. Now, granted, he did capture a whole lot, but the Confederates are capturing these guys all over the battlefield as the battle goes on. It is an en masse capture out there, but it's not all of them. When they get them back to town, meaning the Confederates get the Union troops back to town, they keep most of them in a makeshift stockade around the current Madison County Courthouse.
And the fence that is now in front of the cemetery was around the courthouse, so they herded them all in there. And it was 90 degrees, 95 degrees, they were all sweltering, and the Confederates said, oh, we can't take care of this many people, and paroled them.
So there they were, 4,000 Union soldiers that the Confederates were not able to properly take care of. Prisoners that were going to be sent home. Because early in the Civil War, when you were paroled, you received a piece of paper that basically stated you would not fight against the enemy until you were properly exchanged for a soldier of equal rank. As happens today with exchanges of the same nature. So that's what Kirby Smith started doing. He started paroling these Union soldiers, and he does this at the Mount Pleasant home, which is still standing today and was mentioned earlier as the home base for the Sisters of Charity. The Union soldiers then were allowed to go home. So now, the Battle of Richmond was officially over, but the battle for the state of Kentucky was not. There were still several weeks left in the Confederate campaign to take the Bluegrass state. However, as they moved north towards Cincinnati in the Florence area and west towards Louisville, they were met with resistance and the timing was not right.
In early October, Kirby Smith and Braxton Bragg are both in Frankfort, and they inaugurate a Confederate governor of Kentucky. And about an hour later, that's when they started hearing Union artillery shell the town. And Buell comes out of Louisville. Bragg and Kirby Smith's men never get hooked up together. Buell comes down through Springfield, across over into Boyle County. Bragg is over there, and that's when the Battle of Perryville happens in early October. Some of the troops from the Battle of Richmond are there, namely Patrick Claiborne's boys. Most of them are up around Versailles. There's a lot of argument about the Battle of Perryville. I'm a simpleton when it comes to Civil War battles. Whoever leaves loses. And Braxton Bragg, after a 6-hour fight, give or take a little bit, the next day he decides he's going to leave. And since he kind of outranks Kirby Smith, that's another inherent problem. Is no one person is in charge. Well, both armies retreat back into Tennessee.
Jeopardy question about 2 years ago. What was the only Union capital to fall during the Civil War? Frankfort. And then they went and tried taking Louisville. Well, that wasn't a good idea. There's some people in Louisville that were under Halleck named Grant and Sherman, and that didn't work out too good, and they ended up in Perryville. And the troops gathered and pushed them all back into Tennessee. And that was the entire attempt to take the state of Kentucky. It took 8 weeks. It was very busy.
The overall Union commander at the Battle of Richmond, William Bull Nelson, who was wounded at the fight at the Richmond Cemetery, he is put in charge of the defenses of Louisville. And he has very inexperienced men just doing the best he can. They're coming out of Indiana the best they can. And he gets into an argument with another Union general by the name of Jefferson C. Davis, no kin to the Confederate president. And things get really hot. And on the morning of September the 29th, during another loud altercation between Bull Nelson and Jefferson C. Davis in the lobby of the Galt House in Louisville, not the current Galt House, but the one that was there then, Jefferson C. Davis gets a pistol and shoots and kills Bull Nelson. So Buell loses one of his experienced commanders. Jefferson C. Davis is arrested, but is never officially charged with the murder of Nelson. There is no court-martial. The thinking was, we've got more important things dealing with Edmund Kirby Smith and Braxton Bragg.
And so, in a perfect storm, the Confederates demolished the Union forces at the Battle of Richmond. The Confederates captured over 4,300 Union troops. 206 Union men were killed, 844 wounded, and the rest were captured. For the Confederates, 78 men were killed, 372 were wounded, and a few were missing. And of course, these numbers are approximate because the lack of communication and coordination during the fighting in the Bluegrass state was incomparable to the rest of the Civil War at large. And remember, over 2 million men fought in the Civil War, with over 600,000 dying. And so this goes to show that the efforts in Kentucky were of a small scale. And it was because of this small scale that the Confederates were not able to hold the state of Kentucky. As has been said many times, a campaign in Virginia would extend for 2 to 3 counties. A campaign further west could extend for 2 to 3 states. And so, due to lack of resources and reinforcements, the Confederates could never hold the state of Kentucky. Because while Nashville is near the state of Kentucky, Indianapolis and Louisville served as great cities to funnel in Union reinforcements and supplies. As well, the city of Cincinnati in Ohio served that same purpose. Therefore, the Battle of Richmond shows its significance in the fact that it was a wake-up call for the Union, because the Confederates were able to decimate Union forces at the two-day event of the Battle of Richmond. This was because the Union was disorganized and lacking in communication. So it was time to shape up the army, send in reinforcements, and fight the Confederacy in the state of Kentucky. Otherwise, if the Confederates were able to hold and take the state of Kentucky, it would have been an excellent position to change the tide of the Civil War. The Battle of Richmond, which was won by the Confederates, and the Battle of Perryville thereafter, which was won by the Union, both then became parts of the cultural memory at the time of why the Union had to rally its forces and reclaim the state of Kentucky, because of the symbolic ideas that were represented in freedom, liberty, and justice for all men, and as well because Kentucky was a neutral state, with around 75% of the populace wanting an end to the peculiar and disturbing institution of slavery. And so, with the immorality of slavery and of war, Kentuckians were ready for the Civil War to be ended. When it did come to an end, the Union did enact some Reconstruction policies that were tough. Confederate sympathizers were swiftly executed. This was all done on the premise to eliminate guerrilla warfare in this precious state of Kentucky. And so, with Kentuckians being treated like Southerners, although they were neutral, this led to resentment. Some say Kentuckians call themselves Southern because of those actions, and that title still remains to this day, even though Kentucky was in the middle, literally and figuratively.
I don't think we often, as we think about Civil War or any other war, we often think about the battles and the armies, but we don't think about the community. But this took place in the middle of a community, in the middle of a drought, and the families had to make decisions about what they were going to do about preparing for the winter for their family, having enough covers, having enough wood, because 2 armies had come through and burned fires. Maybe as many as 15,000 men. Think of the campfires that had to be built for them, And what did they use? They used your firewood, and when they got through with that, they used your fences. The fences were all wood, and they burned well. But then your animals are gone, the ones that they didn't eat. So the families suffered terribly after this battle. There are no death certificates at that time in Kentucky, so we don't know how many civilians died as a result of this battle. But I would imagine it was a lot.